Let the world around you settle. Let the sounds of wherever you are, the hum of something distant, the quiet breathing of the night, let all of it become soft and unimportant. We are going somewhere old tonight, older than the oldest city, older than the first written word. We are going back to the very beginning of things, to a time when the world was still deciding what it wanted to be. This is the story of Zeus, king of the gods, ruler of Olympus, the one who carries thunder in his hand and patience in his heart. But before we can speak of Zeus, we must speak of what came before him. Because no story begins where we think it does. Every great life is the last chapter of 1,000 stories that came before it. And Zeus is no different. So let us begin at the beginning, the true beginning, in the very first moment. And you may imagine this as a kind of vast, dark quiet, like the moment just before sleep takes you. There was nothing, or not quite nothing. There was something that had no name yet, something vast and still and full of potential. The ancient Greeks called it chaos. Not chaos as we understand the word, not noise and disorder and confusion, but something more like the primordial dark, the great emptiness that holds within it everything that has not yet become anything. Imagine the deepest, most peaceful darkness you have ever known. The darkness behind closed eyes on a night when you have nowhere to be and nothing to worry about. That kind of darkness, enormous and patient and waiting. And from that darkness, slowly, the way light comes before you even though you've woken, things began to emerge. First came Gaia, the earth herself. She did not appear with a sound or a flash or any great announcement. She simply was. One moment there was only the void, and the next moment there was ground beneath it all. Solid and ancient and warm. Gaia, the great mother, the foundation of everything that would ever live or breathe or grow. And then came Tartarus, the deep place beneath the earth, the lowest, most unreachable pit, where the ground descends so far that even the roots of mountains have never touched its floor. And then came Eros, not love as we know it in our small lives, but something more fundamental, the force that draws things toward one another, that makes one thing want to become part of another. The Greeks understood that nothing in the universe can grow without that pull. Without attraction, there is no creation. And so Eros came early, because without him, nothing else that followed would have been possible. These three, earth and depth, and the pull between things, formed the quiet stage upon which everything else would slowly unfold. And from Gaia, in her vast and ancient way, came more. She brought forth the sky. She called him Uranus. Uranus in the Latin tongue, though the Greeks breathed his name as something softer. He rose above her like a great dome of deep blue and black, studded eventually with the lights we call stars. He was her companion, her covering, her partner in what would come next. Between Gaia and Uranus, the world began to fill. The mountains rose first, great, slow, silent things, lifting themselves from the earth the way a sleeper raises their shoulders, gradual and unhurried. Then the sea came, filling the low places between the high ones, deep and cold and restless in a way that everything else was not. There were others born in those early ages, being so old that even the Greeks, who knew them by name, could not quite picture their faces. The Titans came, 12 great children of Gaia and Uranus, enormous and powerful, more forces of nature than people. They had names: Oceanus, who was the river that circled the world; Ceus and Crius, whose names are harder to picture now but who held great weight in those ancient hours; Hyperion, who was something like the sun before the sun existed as we know it; and Themis, goddess of law and order. Not the laws of cities, but the deeper laws, the ones that govern how seasons change and how promises bind and how time moves only forward, never back. There were others, and from those others came others still. The world was being built, layer by layer, like sediment in a slow river, each age resting upon the last. But Uranus, the Sky Father, was not entirely a gentle presence. He feared what he and Gaia were creating. As child after child was born, some of them strange and enormous, the Cyclopes with their single great eyes, and the Centimanes, beings of 100 hands each. Uranus looked upon them and felt something cold move through him. He was afraid, not of the children themselves precisely, but of what they might become. He was the sky after all. He was vast, and he was high, and he was accustomed to looking down on everything. The idea that something might one day rise higher, or be greater, or take from him the position he held, it was a fear he could not shake. And so he did something that left a wound in the world that would take generations to heal. He pushed his children back into the earth, back into Gaia herself, refusing to let them come fully into the world. Gaia bore the pain of this quietly for a long time, the way the earth bears most things, with a deep, patient endurance. But eventually that patience reached its end. She called her children to her, and to one of them, the youngest of the Titans, she offered a great curved blade she had made from gray flint, cold and sharp and purposeful. His name was Cronus. He was clever and ambitious, and he had the burning energy of something that has been held too long in a closed space. He took the blade. He waited, and when his moment came, he acted swiftly and without hesitation, and the age of Aurenas ended. Let us rest here for a moment in the story, where the air is cool and the night is very still. In those early ages of the world, nothing happened quickly. Ages passed like long, slow breaths. The stars made their circles overhead. The ocean rolled and settled and rolled again. Time was not yet what it would become, measured, counted, divided into days and years. It was simply the large, slow movement of things from one state into another. Cronus became king. He ruled in place of his father, and at first, those who lived under him knew a kind of golden contentment. This was the golden age that the poets would speak of for thousands of years. A time when the earth gave freely of its fruits, when the weather was always gentle, when no one suffered or struggled or went without. Cronus took as his companion his sister Rhea, another of the great Titans, warm and powerful and steady as harvest time. Together they ruled over a world that was, at least on its surface, peaceful. But Cronus carried his father's fear like an inheritance he had not wanted. Aurenas, as he fell, had spoken words that lodged themselves in Cronus like a splinter too deep to reach. He had said, "One of your own children will do to you what you have done to me." Prophecy, or perhaps a curse. The boundary between those two things has always been thin. Cronus could not unknow what he had heard. And so when children began to come, he and Rhea producing child after child, each of them divine, each of them beautiful and powerful and full of possibility, Cronus did something terrible. He swallowed them, one by one. Hestia, the first, goddess of the hearth and the gentle center of any home. Then Demeter, whose touch makes things grow. Then Hera, brilliant and strong-willed even from her very first moments. Poseidon, whose nature was like deep water, complex and restless. Hades, solemn and patient, built for quiet places. Each child was born. Each child was taken. Rhea bore this for a long time. She loved Cronus, in that complicated way that love can exist alongside grief and frustration and a growing, quiet fury. But as the births and the losses accumulated, something in her resolved itself into a single, clear intention. She would protect the next one. He ruled in place of his father, and at first, those who lived under him knew a kind of golden contentment. This was the golden age that the poets would speak of for thousands of years, a time when the earth gave freely of its fruits, when the weather was always gentle, when no one suffered or struggled or went without. Cronus took as his companion his sister Rhea, another of the great Titans, warm and powerful and steady as harvest time. Together they ruled over a world that was, at least on its surface, peaceful. But Cronus carried his father's fear like an inheritance he had not wanted. Aurenas, as he fell, had spoken words that lodged themselves in Cronus like a splinter too deep to reach. He had said, "One of your own children will do to you what you have done to me." Prophecy, or perhaps a curse. The boundary between those two things has always been thin. Cronus could not unknow what he had heard. And so when children began to come, he and Rhea producing child after child, each of them divine, each of them beautiful and powerful and full of possibility, Cronus did something terrible. He swallowed them, one by one. Hestia, the first, goddess of the hearth and the gentle center of any home. Then Demeter, whose touch makes things grow. Then Hera, brilliant and strong-willed even from her very first moments. Poseidon, whose nature was like deep water, complex and restless. Hades, solemn and patient, built for quiet places. Each child was born. Each child was taken. Rhea bore this for a long time. She loved Cronus, in that complicated way that love can exist alongside grief and frustration and a growing, quiet fury. But as the births and the losses accumulated, something in her resolved itself into a single, clear intention. She would protect the next one. It was on the island of Crete that it happened, according to the oldest tellings. In a cave, high in the mountains of a place called Mount Ida, where the rock walls curved like cupped hands and the air was cool and smelled of earth and stone and old time. Some versions of the story say Rhea traveled there in secret. Others say she was guided by Gaia herself, the old earth grandmother who had never forgiven Cronus his cruelties. Either way, Rhea came to that place, and there, in the quiet dark of the mountain cave, a child was born. His name was Zeus, and from the first moment of his existence, something in the air changed, not with thunder or lightning or any of the signs we might expect from such a birth. The world does not always announce its most important moments. Sometimes the most significant things arrive quietly, in the dark, known only to those present and to the patient earth beneath. Rhea held her son in the shadows of that cave. She could not keep him. She knew that. Cronus would come looking, would expect to receive the child as he had received all the others. So she wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth, carefully, lovingly, as though the stone itself were something precious. And when Cronus arrived and held out his hand in that grim expectation he had developed, Rhea gave him the stone wrapped in cloth. And Cronus, without hesitation, swallowed it down. He did not notice. He went away satisfied, the father of a stone, and Rhea remained behind with her true child, her real child, the one who would one day change everything. Zeus was given into the care of others. The nymphs of Crete, gentle and capable, took the infant into their protection. There are stories of a great she-goat named Amalthea who nursed him, her milk rich and ancient, carrying something divine in it. There are stories of young warriors, the Curetes, who would clash their shields and spears together whenever the infant cried, making enough noise to cover the sound and prevent it from reaching Cronus across the distance. Every precaution was taken. Every measure of care was given. The cave was safe. The island was safe. And the child slept and ate and grew. The honey that bees brought. The milk that flowed. The warm stone of the cave floor, worn smooth by years and water. The light that slanted in at certain hours, making the dust in the air glow like something precious. This is where the king of the gods began. Not on a throne, not in a palace, in a cave, tended by nymphs, hidden from his own father, growing slowly in the dark the way all seeds do, patiently, persistently, without yet knowing what they will become. The years passed in the way that years pass in the stories of gods, not day by day as we count them, but in long, unhurried sweeps, like a hand moving over a still surface. Zeus grew. He became strong. He became curious. He walked the hills of Crete and breathed its clean air and learned the feel of wind and stone and open sky, and somewhere in all of that, he became something you could call a young man, though that phrase is far too small for what he was. He did not know his story yet, or only in pieces, but the knowledge found him, as knowledge always does, gradually through the care of those around him, through the stories they told, through the things they let slip when they thought he wasn't listening. He had siblings, 5 of them, in the bell, of his father, and at some point it became clear to him, perhaps not as a decision so much as an understanding that had been arriving for a long time, that he was going to do something about that. The plan was not hatched in a day. The old stories are not always detailed about these preparations, but there is something in the telling that suggests patience and care and the kind of thinking that happens over long walks alone at night. Zeus had time. He used it. He found an ally in an ancient goddess or titaness named Métis. Her name meant wisdom, or cunning, or the kind of intelligence that finds a way where there seems to be no way. She was the first of many who would help him. She prepared a draft, a potion, or a medic, something to undo what Cronus had done, to make him release what he had so long held. How Zeus approached his father, how he gained entry to that presence without being recognized. The stories offer different answers, and perhaps it does not matter. What matters is what happened. Cronus drank what was given to him, and one by one, in reverse order of their swallowing, the gods came back. First came the stone, gray and smooth and unremarkable, disgorged onto the earth where it would remain for many ages, kept at a sacred place called Delphi, where people would later come from all over the known world to seek wisdom. And then came the others. Hades, solemn and unchanged, patient as he had ever been. Poseidon, shaking with something like relief, his eyes the color of deep water. Hera, brilliant and fierce-eyed, pulling herself upright with a dignity that the darkness of her father's stomach had done nothing to diminish. And Demeter, warm and grounded, and Hestia, still and centered, carrying within her already the quiet warmth that she would forever be known for. They were all fully grown. Time had passed inside Cronus in a strange way, or they had grown there in a compressed version of the years Zeus had spent in the open air of Crete. Either way, they emerged as adults, divine and powerful and fundamentally themselves. Family, reunited, for the first time. What followed was not swift. The conflict between the children of Cronus and the Titans who had ruled the world under Cronus, it did not resolve in a day or a year or even in what we might think of as a reasonable span of time. The old sources speak of 10 years. 10 years of war on a scale so large that the shaking of it could be felt in the foundations of the earth. This was called the Titanomachy, which is a word that simply means the War of the Titans. And it was the first great conflict the world had ever known. On one side, Zeus and his siblings, 6 young gods who had everything to gain and nothing of the old world to lose. On the other, Cronus and most of the Titans, vast and powerful and entrenched in the way of things that have ruled for a long time. The war might have gone on forever, but Zeus had another move to make. Deep beneath the earth, in that vast and lightless prison called Tartarus, there were creatures who had been there since the very beginning, the ones Aurenas had pushed away and hidden for fear of their power. The Cyclopes, with their terrible eyes and their extraordinary craft, and the Centimanes, the 100-handed ones, whose sheer strength was unlike anything else in the world. They had been there a very long time, and when Zeus descended into that dark place and opened their chains, when he offered them not just freedom but recognition, when he saw them and treated them as worthy of dignity, they were moved in a way that old and powerful beings rarely allow themselves to be moved. They joined him. The Cyclopes brought gifts. 3 gifts, one for each of the brothers who would rule. For Zeus, they made lightning, not the natural phenomenon exactly, but something refined and concentrated, bolts of electric fire that he could hold in his hand and throw with the precision of long practice. For Poseidon, a trident, 3-pronged and powerful, capable of splitting rock and raising seas. For Hades, a helmet of invisibility, fitting for the brother who would come to rule the unseen places. With these gifts, the balance of the war shifted, and with the Centimanes throwing mountains with their 100 hands, boulder after boulder launched in great cascading barrages that shook the world to its roots. The Titans slowly could not hold. Cronus fell. The remaining Titan forces were driven back. Most were bound and cast into Tartarus, the same dark, deep place from which Zeus had freed the Cyclopes, now serving a different purpose. The wheel of things had turned again, as it always does, as it always will. Let me pause here and let the story breathe. Imagine now that the fire beside which this story is being told has settled lower. The big flames have gone. What remains is the orange glow of coals, steady and warm, requiring nothing from you, asking nothing. The night outside is deep and quiet, a breeze, perhaps, moving through somewhere. The great war is over. The world is quiet again, or as quiet as a world can be when it has just been through 10 years of the largest conflict ever known. Now comes something different. Now comes the long, slow work of building something. After the war, the 3 brothers stood at the edge of things and made a decision that would shape the world as we know it. They drew lots. There is something both fair and strange about this, that the division of all of existence should come down to chance. And yet it suits the brothers in a way. There was no negotiation that could have satisfied all 3, no argument that would not have seeded future conflict. So chance it was. Zeus drew the sky, Poseidon drew the sea, and Hades, solemn, patient, accepting, drew the underworld. the deep places beneath the earth, the realm of the dead. The earth itself, the solid ground that Gaia had always been, was held in common between them, belonging to all and to none. Zeus established his home on the highest mountain of the Greek world, Mount Olympus. Its peaks were said to extend beyond the clouds, into a clear blue air that no weather ever troubled, where the light was always golden and the sky was always open. Here he would hold court. Here the gods would gather. Here the business of the world would be conducted. And so Olympus became the center of things. The gods took their places. Hera, who would become Zeus's wife and queen, took her place beside him on the highest seat. Apollo, not yet born but coming, the god of light and music and the healing clarity of reason. Artemis, his twin, huntress and moon tender. Athena, who would emerge fully formed from Zeus's own head in a moment we will come to in time. Hermes, quick and clever. Ares, loud and combative. Aphrodite, born long before all of this, from sea foam, carrying with her the force of desire. Hephaestus at his forge. Demeter still tending the earth's growing things. Hestia keeping the sacred fire. Family, a court, a civilization of the divine, arranged on a mountain above the clouds, mirroring in their very human way all the complications and affections and grievances that families everywhere share. It is worth staying with Zeus for a while now, before we follow him into the many stories that make up his long life. Because Zeus is a complicated figure, if you sit with him long enough. He is not the simple king god of thunder that a quick summary might suggest. He is something older and more layered than that. He contains within him contradictions that the Greeks understood as natural, as simply the nature of great power. He was just. He valued fair dealing. He kept the scales of divine order, what the Greeks called dike, carefully maintained, and he took it seriously when those scales were upset, when oaths were broken or hospitality was violated or the natural order of things was disturbed. He had a genuine care for the world below him, a genuine interest in the fates of mortals who were small and brief, but who had a quality of intensity about them that the immortal gods sometimes found compelling. And yet he was also impulsive, easily moved by beauty, capable of anger that came too fast and punished too hard. His treatment of those who crossed him could be swift and disproportionate. He was a king who had grown up in hiding, who had waged war at a young age, who had taken power through conflict, and all of that was in him, mixed in with the justice and the wisdom. He was not always good, but he was always interesting, and the myths that gather around him are the myths of a figure who is genuinely trying, who holds enormous power and is not always sure what to do with it, who loves his family and his world and sometimes harms the things he loves, who is surrounded by forces that even he cannot fully control. The Greeks did not ask their gods to be perfect. They asked them to be real, and Zeus is nothing if not real. His marriage to Hera is one of the central relationships in all of mythology, and it is worth understanding before we proceed. Hera was his sister, which troubles modern ears but was simply the nature of divine genealogy in those ancient stories. She was powerful in her own right, goddess of marriage, of the sacred bond between partners, of women and queenship and the dignity of commitment. She was proud and she was fierce, and she did not accept weakness or indignity quietly. Their marriage was, like many real marriages, full of genuine love and genuine conflict. Hera saw Zeus clearly, all of him, the good and the frustrating and the things that required patience. She had been swallowed by his father and freed by his plan. She knew what he had done and what it had cost. She respected him with the full knowledge of his flaws, and she did not look away from those flaws. The stories of Hera pursuing Zeus's various children from other unions, her famous jealousy, a genuine interest in the fates of mortals who were small and brief, but who had a quality of intensity about them that the immortal gods sometimes found compelling. And yet he was also impulsive, easily moved by beauty, capable of anger that came too fast and punished too hard. His treatment of those who crossed him could be swift and disproportionate. He was a king who had grown up in hiding, who had waged war at a young age, who had taken power through conflict, and all of that was in him, mixed in with the justice and the wisdom. He was not always good, but he was always interesting, and the myths that gather around him are the myths of a figure who is genuinely trying, who holds enormous power and is not always sure what to do with it, who loves his family and his world and sometimes harms the things he loves, who is surrounded by forces that even he cannot fully control. The Greeks did not ask their gods to be perfect. They asked them to be real, and Zeus is nothing if not real. His marriage to Hera is one of the central relationships in all of mythology, and it is worth understanding before we proceed. Hera was his sister, which troubles modern ears but was simply the nature of divine genealogy in those ancient stories. She was powerful in her own right, goddess of marriage, of the sacred bond between partners, of women and queenship and the dignity of commitment. She was proud and she was fierce, and she did not accept weakness or indignity quietly. Their marriage was, like many real marriages, full of genuine love and genuine conflict. Hera saw Zeus clearly, all of him, the good and the frustrating and the things that required patience. She had been swallowed by his father and freed by his plan. She knew what he had done and what it had cost. She respected him with the full knowledge of his flaws, and she did not look away from those flaws. The stories of Hera pursuing Zeus's various children from other unions, her famous jealousy, these are usually told in a way that makes her seem unreasonable. But if you sit with her quietly, you begin to see a different story. A queen who was expected to tolerate what could not be tolerated with grace, who channeled her hurt into the only actions available to her, who was constrained by her role in ways that were profoundly unfair. She is not a villain. She is a wife in an impossible situation, responding in the ways she knew how. And Zeus, for his part, returned always. However far he wandered, however many other stories he became briefly a part of, Olympus was his home and Hera was his queen, and he never seemed to want it otherwise. Let us move now into the stories that spread from Zeus like light from a great fire, stories that involve gods and mortals and the long complicated thread of what passes between them. There is no better place to start than with fire, and with a titan named Prometheus. Prometheus was different from most of his kin. While many of the titans had fought against Zeus in the Great War, Prometheus had stood apart, or had even aided the Olympians. He was a thinker, a planner, a being with an unusual affinity for the small mortal creatures who had begun to populate the earth. Humanity in those early ages was fragile, cold and unprotected. Without fire, the nights were very long and very dark, and the beasts that moved in the darkness were not afraid of them. Prometheus watched this and felt something that might have been pity or affection, or simply a principled objection to unnecessary suffering. He went to Olympus. He stood before Zeus and made his argument. Give the humans fire. Let them have warmth and light and the capacity to cook and to work metal and to hold back the night. Zeus said no. There are different explanations offered for why. Perhaps he was cautious about giving mortals too much, about accelerating their development in ways that could not be undone. Perhaps he had a broader view of the order of things, that Prometheus's affection for mortals prevented him from sharing. Perhaps, as some tellings suggest, he had a kind of plan in motion and fire was part of a future gift, not a present one. Whatever his reason, he refused. Prometheus did not accept the refusal. He climbed, or in some versions, he was already among the sun's fire, having access to places that others did not, and he took a flame. He hollowed out a stalk of the fennel plant, which is pithy inside and can carry a coal without burning through, and he hid the fire in it and brought it down. He gave it to humanity, and the nights on earth changed. Zeus was not pleased. There is something worth considering here, in the story's quiet, something that the myth holds without fully explaining. Zeus knew that Prometheus had done what he did out of genuine care for mortals, not out of defiance for its own sake. He knew Prometheus was not wrong exactly, that the humans would benefit from fire in real and lasting ways. And yet he punished him severely. Prometheus was taken to the farthest edge of the world. Some say to the Caucasus Mountains, to a ridge of rock where the wind never stopped and the sky was vast and gray. And there he was chained, bound to the rock with chains that could not be broken. And each day an eagle, a great divine eagle purposeful in its terrible task, would come and eat of his liver. And each night, because he was immortal, the liver would grow back. And the next day the eagle would return. This was the punishment. It was not a small thing. It was a terrible thing. And the old storytellers knew it was terrible, They did not try to soften it or justify it away. Zeus did this. It was not just. It was not proportionate. It was the act of a king who had been defied and who responded with something harder than defiance deserved. But even here, the story is not simple, because the Greeks knew that what Prometheus had done was also real. The fire was real. Humanity kept it, worked with, thrived. And in all the centuries that Prometheus hung on his rock, watching the world below him change and grow and build things his gift had made possible, there is something in the telling that suggests he did not regret it. He bore his punishment. He waited. And eventually, because all things in stories eventually reach resolution, even the hardest ones, a hero would come. But that is a story for a later hour, for another night perhaps, for when you have followed the thread of Zeus a little further and we arrive at the age of heroes. For now, let us leave Prometheus on his ridge, patient in the way that only true believers in their own choices can be patient, and let the stars move above him in their quiet courses. There is a story at the heart of Zeus's family that is also the story of why winter exists. It involves his sister Demeter, who was among the most beloved of the gods, not for her power in combat or her cleverness in strategy, but for the simple, essential gift she held. Everything that grew from the ground grew because of her. Every grain of wheat, every olive, every fig and grape and blade of grass. Every harvest that had ever fed a hungry person came from the quiet attentiveness of Demeter. She had a daughter. Her name was Persephone. In a world full of divine beings, Persephone shines with a particular quality, something spring-like and unguarded, the way light looks in early morning before the day has grown accustomed to itself. She and her mother were inseparable, and the earth reflected that closeness. Things grew and bloomed and continued in their abundance because Demeter was content, and Demeter was content in large part because her daughter was near. Hades noticed Persephone. The king of the underworld was, in most ways, a quiet presence in the stories of the gods. He had his realm. He ruled it with a certain grave dignity, and he did not often involve himself in the affairs above. But Persephone caught his attention, and perhaps, because he was unaccustomed to wanting things, when the want came, it came with a force that he did not pause to moderate. He went to Zeus. He asked for Persephone. What followed in the conversation between these two brothers, the king of the sky and the king of the underworld, is not recorded in detail by the oldest sources. But what happened suggests that Zeus gave some form of assent, or perhaps simply did not object, or perhaps, in the complicated mathematics of divine politics, felt that he could not refuse his brother outright. He did not tell Demeter, and Hades, with whatever permission or silence he had received, went up into the world and found Persephone in a meadow full of flowers, which is always how the stories place her, surrounded by beauty, in the middle of a perfectly ordinary day. A flower caught her attention. She reached for it, and the earth opened beneath her, and Hades came up through the dark gap in his chariot, and Persephone was gone. The earth closed over the place where she had stood. Demeter heard her daughter cry out. Not the words, not clearly enough to know what had happened. Only the sound. The way a mother hears a sound and knows, without being told, that something is wrong. She searched. For 9 days she searched without stopping, without eating, without rest, carrying torches through the darkness when night came, refusing to let the dark be a reason to stop looking. She asked everyone she met. She walked the whole world, it seemed, growing more desperate and more grief-stricken and more furious as the days accumulated and no answer came. And as she searched, she forgot what she was. Or perhaps more accurately, her grief consumed the part of her that made the earth grow. She had no attention left for harvests or seeds or the slow work of cultivation. The grain in the fields began to fail. The trees stopped producing fruit. The earth grew dry and unresponsive, as if it too had forgotten what it was for. Mortals suffered. They went hungry. They made offerings and prayed, and none of it helped, because the goddess who governed their food was not in a place where offerings could reach her. Eventually, through the kindness of Hecate, who had heard something in the dark, and through the testimony of Helios, the sun, who sees everything from his high crossing of the sky, Demeter learned the truth. Her daughter was in the underworld, and Zeus had known. What she felt then was beyond anger, though anger was part of it. It was a cold, enormous, implacable grief that turned into decision. She would not return to Olympus. She would not resume her work. She would sit among the mortals she had always cared for, in disguise, and she would let the world continue dying until her daughter was returned. Zeus heard the silence of the growing world. He counted the cost of it, and found it was not a cost he could sustain. The mortals would perish. The gods would lose the worship and sacrifice that they, in their strange way, needed. The order of things was disrupting. He sent Hermes, quick, clever, trusted messenger, down into the underworld to negotiate Persephone's return. Hades, to his credit, agreed. Or perhaps he had always meant to. The stories are not entirely clear on this, and perhaps it does not matter. What matters is that Persephone was to come back. But before she left, and here the story takes the turn that changes everything. She ate pomegranate seed, perhaps 6 of them, depending on which telling you follow. Something small, something she may not have fully understood the significance of, or something she understood completely and chose anyway. The ancient rule of the underworld: eat of its food and you belong to it, at least in part, forever. 6 months above, 6 months below. That was the compromise that Hermes and Hades and eventually Zeus worked out, with Demeter's grief pressing on all of them like the weight of stopped weather. And so the world learned its rhythm. When Persephone returns to the upper world in spring, Demeter's joy makes everything bloom. The long warmth of spring and summer, the abundance of growing and harvesting, all of it is Demeter's happiness made visible, made real, made edible. And when autumn comes and Persephone must descend again, the warmth goes with her. Demeter pulls back her gifts. The earth hardens. The days grow short. The leaves let go of their trees and fall. And the world waits, as it always has, for the return of what it loves. This is where winter comes from. Not from the mechanics of a tilted planet, though that too is true, but from the grief of a mother, from love and loss, and the complicated mercy of a return that is never quite complete. Take a breath here if you like. Let the story settle around you like the air settles when wind stops. We have been through the birth of the world and the birth of Zeus and the great war and the making of the seasons. And still there is so much more. Because the life of Zeus was long, longer than anything we have words for, and it touched the lives of heroes and mortals and monsters and gods in ways that spread like water, reaching into every corner of the world the Greeks knew and loved. Let us continue. Gently. There is no rush. Of all the strange and vivid stories that gather around Zeus, there is one that has always arrested the imagination in a particular way. The birth of Athena, before he was married to Hera, or in some tellings, alongside it, in the complicated way that divine genealogy often runs, Zeus had a relationship with the goddess Métis. She who was wisdom, she who had helped him in the freeing of his siblings, she whose counsel was among the most valuable in the world. Métis became pregnant, and once again, a prophecy arrived, or perhaps Zeus simply received a knowing of the kind that gods sometimes receive without being told. The child that Métis carried would be extraordinarily powerful. A daughter, the prophecy, said first, then a son, and the son would be greater than his father. Zeus, still carrying the shadow of what had happened with Cronus, still sensitive to that particular pressure, heard this and made a decision. He swallowed Métis. You might recognize the shape of this, the terrible repetition of a pattern. Father swallowing children, children swallowing parents. The cycle of power trying to prevent its own undoing, discovering too late that the preventions are exactly what causes the undoing. But what happened next was not what Cronus had experienced. Inside Zeus, and the image here is so strange and so vivid that the Greeks who first told it must have paused on it, turned it over. Métis continued her work. She made things. She made armor, hammering it gently in the dark interior, and a helmet, and everything that her daughter would need. The hammering gave Zeus terrible headaches, blinding, impossible pain in his head that no rest or remedy could touch. Hephaestus, the craftsman god, the smith, was summoned or was present, or understood what was needed in that way that craftsmen sometimes understand what is needed without being told. He brought his tools to Zeus's head. He struck with a great blow, and Athena was born, fully grown, in full armor, with a war cry on her lips and wisdom already bright in her eyes. She stepped out of her father's head already complete, already herself, already in possession of everything she would ever be. The goddess of wisdom, of craft, of strategic warfare, of the kind of fighting that wins not through brute force but through clear thinking. She was also patron of the olive tree, of weaving, of the civilized arts that make communities out of collections of people. Zeus, whatever he had intended by swallowing her mother, could not help but love his daughter. There is something moving in the image, the god of the sky looking at this fully formed being who had emerged from his own pain, who looked back at him with eyes that held everything Métis had been, and finding in her not a threat but a marvel. Athena remained close to her father throughout the long centuries of the myths. She argued with him when she thought he was wrong. She carried out his will when she agreed with it. She moved through the world with a certainty and a clarity that few other divine beings possessed. She never married. She belonged entirely to herself, which in a pantheon of complicated relationships and obligations was its own kind of freedom and its own kind of dignity. Let us pause the forward movement of time for a little while and spend some quiet moments on the mountain. Olympus was not, in the imagining of the Greeks, merely a physical place. It was something more layered than a mountain. It was the place where the eternal met the particular, where the forces that governed the world took shape as beings who could speak and argue and be angry and be delighted. It was, in its strange way, a home. The gods who lived there were a family in all the ways that families are difficult and nourishing and impossible to fully leave. Hera kept her dignity and her watchfulness at Zeus's side. She was not an easy companion, but she was a true one. She saw him completely and remained, which is not a small thing. Apollo walked through those divine halls carrying a lyre, which he played with a skill that made the very walls of heaven hum in response. He was also the god of the sun's passage, not the sun itself, for Helios held that role in the oldest tellings, but of the quality of sunlight, of its clarity and its capacity to illuminate and to heal. He was also the god of prophecy. The oracle at Delphi spoke in his name, and people came from all the known world to hear what the god's voice might say about their futures. Artemis, his twin, moved between the divine and the wild. She was most at home in forests, in the unmarked places where the paths of mortals thin out and the old world reasserts itself. She kept a company of nymphs and huntresses around her, and she was fierce in the protection of them. She was also the goddess of the moon, of childbirth, of the transitions between states, the liminal moments that are neither one thing nor another. Hermes moved constantly. He was the messenger, yes, but also the guide of souls, the patron of travelers and merchants and thieves, the clever one who could talk his way in or out of almost anything. He wore winged sandals that kept his feet never quite on the ground. He carried a staff entwined with serpents. He was the one Zeus trusted with delicate errands, the one who could be sent into difficult places and trusted to find a way through. Ares was the god of war, but not the war of strategy and craft that Athena represented. His war was the chaos and the heat of actual combat, the part of fighting that is body and blood and the overwhelming pressure of it. He was passionate and loud and not well liked on Olympus, which is not an uncommon fate for those who embody things that are necessary but unpleasant. Aphrodite moved through the world like something that the world had been waiting for. She had been born, according to the oldest accounts, from sea foam, from the place where Auranus's blood had fallen into the ocean after Cronus's act, and from that union of the divine and the sea, beauty had simply emerged. She carried with her the force of desire, which is among the most powerful forces in the world, and she was not entirely careful with it. Hephaestus, her husband by some accounts, was nothing like her on the surface. He was a craftsman, a maker. He worked in fire and metal and produced things of extraordinary beauty and function. His forge was somewhere beneath the earth, in the volcanic places, and the things he made, divine armor, exquisite jewelry, machines of intricate purpose, were among the wonders of the immortal world. He had been, according to some of the stories, thrown from Olympus as a child by Hera, some say ashamed of his imperfection, by Zeus in a moment of anger, according to others. He had fallen for a long time and landed hard, and had risen from that fall nonetheless, had made a place for himself through his irreplaceable skill. Dionysus came later to the mountain, a god of wine and ecstasy and the loss of the bound itself, of the feeling that comes when the walls we build around ourselves are temporarily dissolved. He was complicated and beloved and unsettling in equal measure, and his arrival on Olympus was its own long story. These were the gods. This was the family. This was the world that Zeus presided over from his throne at the highest point of Olympus, where the air was always clear and the sky was always close. The relationship between Zeus and the mortal world is perhaps the longest thread in his story. He watched humanity from his high mountain with an attention that was not casual. He had opinions about them. He had feelings about them. He intervened in their lives in ways that were sometimes helpful and sometimes catastrophic and sometimes simply inexplicable, the way that weather is sometimes inexplicable, not arbitrary exactly, but following a logic that is too large to see clearly from inside it. He valued certain things in mortals above almost everything else. Hospitality. The Greeks called it xenia, and it was not simply being nice to guests. It was a sacred covenant, a recognition that strangers are vulnerable and that the measure of a community is how it treats the vulnerable. Zeus himself was called Zeus Xenios, Zeus the protector of guests and strangers. He took violations of this deeply seriously. When a host harmed a guest, or a guest betrayed a host's trust, Zeus noticed, and he acted. The myths are full of stories in which Zeus travels in disguise among mortals, not to spy on them exactly, but to see them as they actually are when they believe no one of consequence is watching. He and Hermes walking dusty roads as old men, seeking shelter. The stories that follow these wanderings are sometimes tender and sometimes severe, depending on what they find. There was a couple, Baucis and Philemon, old and poor and living in a cottage so small it barely held them. When two travelers came to their door, the rest of their village turned the strangers away. Baucis and Philemon opened their door and gave everything they had. Their small meal, their olive oil, their wine that somehow kept refilling. They gave without counting the cost, without knowing who they were hosting. And when the disguise was lifted, and the strangers revealed themselves as Zeus and Hermes, the old couple were not struck with awe or terror so much as a kind of simple gratitude, as if they had always hoped that the universe was the kind of place where goodness was eventually seen. Zeus granted their wish, that they might die together at the same moment, never having to live without the other. And the story says that when they died, they became trees, an oak and a linden, intertwined, standing together in the place where their cottage had been. It is one of the gentler stories in a mythology full of difficult ones. A reminder that the god of the sky and the thunder was also capable of a kind of grace. But Zeus also destroyed. When the arrogance of mortals grew large enough to threaten the order of things, when a king named Lycaon tested him by serving him human flesh at a feast, trying to prove that the god could be fooled or corrupted, Zeus's response was swift and complete. He unmade the king, turned him into a wolf whose hunger could never be satisfied, and sent out a flood to cleanse the world of the violence and arrogance that had become epidemic in that age. The flood, the great cleansing. Zeus decided that the mortal world had grown too far from what it should be. Not out of hatred, the decision is portrayed in most tellings as sorrowful, the way a gardener feels sorrowful cutting back something that has grown. Sick, but he decided nonetheless. The waters rose. They covered the plains. They covered the hills. They rose until even the highest ground was submerged. One man and his wife survived. Deucalion, son of Prometheus, who had been warned by his father. Another proof of the complicated love Prometheus bore for mortals, reaching even through his chains on the rock. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha built a chest, a great floating box, and rode the waters for 9 days until they settled on the peak of Mount Parnassus. When the waters withdrew, they looked out at a world empty and clean and waiting. They prayed. They asked how to replenish what had been lost. And the answer they received was strange and beautiful in the way that divine answers often are. Take the bones of your mother and cast them behind you. Pyrrha was troubled. How could they disturb their mother's bones? But Deucalion understood the earth was their true mother. The bones of the earth were stones. They walked across the silent, wet world, casting stones behind them over their shoulders. And each stone Deucalion cast became a man, and each stone Pyrrha cast became a woman, and the world began to fill again with people who would build it anew. It is a story about survival and renewal and the strange instructions that lead to life when everything seems to have ended. And it has lived in human memory for thousands of years, preserved and retold, because it speaks to something that humans have always understood, that after the great clearings, something can grow again. The myths of Zeus eventually open into the Age of Heroes, that long, complicated period when gods and mortals intertwined their stories in ways that produced beings who were neither fully one nor fully the other. Heracles, Perseus, Achilles, Minos, Helen, the figures who stand at the edge of divinity and humanity, who accomplish impossible things and suffer impossible losses, who move through the world on a scale larger than ordinary but smaller than divine. Many of these were children of Zeus, born from unions with mortal women. And this is another of the complications of his story, the part that is hardest to render simply. Zeus moved through the mortal world and was drawn to human beauty and courage and particularity in ways that were real and that had consequences. The children he produced were real. The suffering they sometimes caused to their mothers and to Hera's pride and to the order of divine marriage was real. Perseus was born of Danae, a princess locked in a tower of bronze by her father, who had also received a prophecy and was also trying to outrun it. The tower did not help. Zeus found a way, as he always seemed to, came as a shower of golden light, which is an image that contains something genuinely beautiful in it. The idea of divinity arriving not with thunder but with warmth and radiance. Perseus grew to be a hero of particular cleverness and courage, a slayer of the Gorgon Medusa and rescuer of Andromeda and founder of dynasties. Heracles came from Alcmene, a woman of extraordinary character, and his life was among the most consequential in all of the heroic age. 12 great labors, each more impossible than the last, performed under the weight of divine resentment and yet completed through sheer stubborn will. He was the greatest of the heroes, and he was also among the most burdened, and his story ends with fire and with a transformation that suggests even the mortal form can, under extraordinary circumstances, become something more. These heroes carried something of Olympus in them. They were proof that what happened above had consequences below, that the lives of the gods were not merely the lives of the powerful, but touched every level of the world they oversaw. The Trojan War gathered many of these threads together. Helen, whose father was said to be Zeus himself in some accounts, or whose extraordinary beauty was simply of a divine quality, the stories vary, became the center of a conflict that drew both mortals and immortals into a decade of war. Zeus presided over the whole catastrophe with something that defies easy description. He had favorites on both sides. He made pronouncements. He permitted fate to take certain paths and intervened to redirect others. He sat on Olympus and watched the human suffering below with what the old poets suggest was genuine feeling, grief at the deaths, pride in the courage, sorrow at the waste, while also knowing that the war was in some ways necessary, in the great unfathomable arithmetic of things that the gods sometimes reference but never fully explain to the mortals living through them. He protected his son Sarpedon as long as he could. The Trojan hero who was also a child of Zeus. When his death approached, when fate made it clear the hour had come, Zeus asked Hera if he might save him. And here is something worth holding. Hera said, "No, not without sympathy." She understood what it was to love a child and fear their loss. But she said that if Zeus broke the laws of fate for his son, then every other god would want to do the same for theirs, and the order of the mortal world, the order that made mortal life meaningful, that made courage valuable because it was finite, would unravel. Zeus accepted this. He did not overrule her. He let his son die, and he wept tears of blood, which fell on the earth and were the last of what he could give. This moment, a god weeping tears of blood for a mortal child, is one of the most human moments in the Iliad. In all of mythology, it is a reminder that power is not the same as freedom, that even the king of the gods is subject to forces larger than his will. He could move mountains. He could not save his son. After the Age of Heroes, which came to its complicated, exhausted end with the fall of Troy and the long, difficult homecomings that followed, the world entered into something quieter. The Age of Heroes is loud and burning and full of extremity. What comes after is slower. The gods recede a little from direct involvement. Mortals build their cities and write their histories and begin to interpret the old stories rather than live inside them. Zeus continued to rule from Olympus, But the nature of that rule shifted gradually. He became more what we might call cosmic, less concerned with individual human affairs, more involved in the great structures of justice and order that kept the world from falling back into chaos. He was the upholder of oaths. When two people swore something sacred, they swore it in the name of Zeus, and Zeus held that vow, kept it real, remembered it when the parties had forgotten or wished they could. This was serious work. The fabric of human community, of trust and agreement and the reliability of promises, depended on it. He was the punisher of hubris. Hubris, which is not simply pride but the specific overreach of trying to be something more than what you are, of forgetting your place in the order of things. This was something Zeus reliably and firmly addressed. Mortals who forgot that they were mortal, who reached past the limits assigned to them, found that the response from above was not gentle. And he continued to speak to humanity through oracles. Through Delphi most famously, where his son Apollo served as the divine voice, translating whatever the divine wanted to communicate into the cryptic, layered language that oracles favored, never quite clear, always capable of multiple interpretations, leaving the responsibility of understanding with the human who asked. This is one of the quieter aspects of Zeus that is sometimes overlooked. He wanted to communicate with humanity. He wanted there to be a channel between above and below. The oracle was that channel, imperfect and ambiguous as it was. People came from everywhere. Kings and farmers and generals and young people afraid of their futures. They made the journey to Delphi, made their offerings, and asked the questions. And the oracle answered, in her smoke-filled chamber, in words that required interpretation, in language that sometimes helped and sometimes led the questioner exactly where they would have arrived anyway. The voice of Apollo, which was also in some sense the voice of the divine order, spoke. And Zeus sat above it all and kept the world in balance, as well as the world could be kept in balance, which was never perfectly and always with the understanding that balance is not a state but a practice. Something that requires constant attention, constant adjustment, constant willingness to respond when the scales tip too far in any direction. There is something that is rarely spoken about directly in the myths but that lives beneath them like groundwater. The gods do not die. They do not age. They do not change in the fundamental ways that mortals change, shaped by time and loss and the slow accumulation of experience. And this is its own kind of weight. Zeus had watched humanity for longer than human history could contain. He had seen civilizations rise and be overtaken. He had seen the same mistakes made across centuries with only the names changed. He had watched people he had briefly loved grow old and die, mortals with their brief bright lives, burning like sparks and going out. The Greeks imagined that the gods felt this, not as the same grief a mortal feels, which is urgent and piercing and immediate, but as something larger and slower, a kind of accumulated awareness of the smallness and the largeness of mortal life simultaneously. How brief it is, how intense, how fully these small beings commit to things that will not last. There is a line in one of the old poems, though the exact words are lost and only the sense remains, where Zeus looks down at the field of battle and calls mortals the most pitiable of all creatures. Not with contempt, with something closer to tenderness. They know they will die. They fight anyway. They love anyway. They build anyway. They hope anyway. He admired this in his way. The gods were powerful and the gods were eternal and the gods had resources of will and strength that no human could match. But they did not have the particular quality of knowing that they would lose everything and choosing, in the face of that knowledge, to value it anyway. That was exclusively mortal. And Zeus, from his high mountain, found it extraordinary. There is a force in the Greek universe that even Zeus does not command. The Moirai, the Fates. 3 sisters who sit spinning and measuring and cutting the thread of every life, mortal and divine alike. Clotho, who spins the thread of life. Lachesis, who measures it, and Atropos, whose name means she who cannot be turned, who cuts it. Even Zeus, in the understanding of the Greeks, could not simply override fate. He could work within it. He could sometimes know what it decreed. He could sometimes intercede, as he did with various heroes at critical moments, buying them a little more time or a slightly different shape to their story. But he could not undo what the fates had woven. This is one of the most philosophically rich ideas in all of Greek mythology, that the supreme power in the universe is not a person, divine or otherwise, but a process, pattern. The way things are woven together across time, which no single will, no matter how great, can simply overwrite. Some ancient sources suggest that Zeus himself did not know the full shape of what the fates had decreed, that he consulted them as mortals consulted oracles, hoping to understand rather than to change. Others suggest that Zeus and fate were so intertwined as to be indistinguishable, that what Zeus willed was fate, or that fate was simply the fullest expression of what the divine intelligence wanted over the longest view. Either way, it places Zeus in an interesting position. He is not the supreme architect of all that happens. He is the administrator of a universe whose deepest laws were set before him, and perhaps before his father, and perhaps before Gaia herself. He holds the balance. He maintains the order. But the final shape of things belongs to something larger than any of them. There is something calming in this, if you sit with it. It means that the universe has a structure, that things are not simply happening at random, buffeted by whoever has the most power in a given moment. That beneath the storms and the disputes and the beautiful mess of gods and mortals and monsters and heroes, there is a pattern, a weaving, something that holds. As the Greek world understood it, the gods did not end so much as recede. When the stories were no longer being told in the same way, when the Romans absorbed the Greek pantheon and renamed its members and built their own temples to their own versions of these same divine forces, Zeus became Jupiter, and the thunder still rolled, and the eagles still circled, and the oak trees still held something of the sacred in their spreading crowns. And when that too eventually gave way to other faiths and other understandings of the divine, the gods did not die. They became myths, which is to say, they became stories. And stories do not die. Zeus sat in the imagination of every person who has ever looked up at a thunderstorm and felt something vast and complicated move through them. He is in the vertigo you feel at the edge of a high cliff, in the clean smell of air after lightning, in the particular quality of mountain light in late afternoon that seems almost to have intention in it. The Greeks told his story for centuries, and then others told it in their own language, and then scholars preserved it, and then writers and painters and sculptors carried it forward. And now, on a quiet night, at the edge of sleep, we are telling it again. This is what stories do. They outlast everything except the need for them. Let us come now to the end of our long evening with Zeus. We have traveled through the darkness before the world existed, and through Gaia's patient emergence, and through the brutal fear of Cronus, and through the hidden cave where an infant god breathed his first breath among goats and nymphs and the cool stone of a Cretan mountain. We have followed him through the Great War and the making of the world's order and the division of the sky and sea and underworld among three brothers who played at chance with everything that mattered. We have sat with Demeter in her grief. We have watched Prometheus on his rock. We have seen the flood recede and the heroes rise and the walls of Troy finally fall. We have sat, for a little while, in the presence of something ancient and strange and genuinely beautiful. The Greek understanding that the divine is not simple, that power does not preclude feeling, that even the king of the gods sits within laws larger than himself and weeps tears of blood for those he cannot save. And we have seen that the world's order, whatever its imperfections, and they are many, holds. Demeter's grief becomes the seasons. Prometheus's gift becomes civilization. Even the worst floods recede and leave the ground clean for what comes next. The myths of Zeus are not, in the end, stories about divine perfection. They are stories about the difficulty of holding power well, about the tension between strength and care, about what it means to rule something as complicated and beloved as the world. He did not always succeed. He was not meant to always succeed. He was meant to try, across the long span of divine time, and to keep adjusting, to balance the scales again when they tipped, to send Hermes where someone needed a messenger, to let the fates run their thread and trust the weaving. He was, in his grand and flawed and genuinely interesting way, doing his best. And now the fire has burned very low. The coals are barely orange now, just a deep settled glow at the center, more warmth than light. The night outside is at its deepest, the hour when the world is most fully asleep and the stars have made most of their crossing. Zeus is on his mountain. The air up there is clear and still, and below him the world is quiet, and the sky that is his kingdom stretches in all directions, dark and salted with light, going further than thought can follow. He has been there a very long time. He will be there still, in some form, when we close our eyes tonight. In the clouds that move against each other before rain comes. in the clean, charged silence after lightning, in the high, wide feeling of standing somewhere open and looking up at a sky that goes further than you can understand. The divine, the Greeks knew, is not separate from the world. It lives inside the weather and the seasons and the love that makes things grow. It lives in oaths kept and hospitality offered and the stubborn, strange courage of mortal people building things that will not last. It lives in stories, told quietly beside fires, in the long and patient dark. Let the story rest now. Let the world outside do what it does in the deep night. The slow breathing of trees, the distant movement of water, the stars continuing their ancient courses overhead. You have been in good company tonight. Sleep well,